is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Limited Resources. This episode number 324. My name is Marshall. I'm one of your Limited Resources, and joining me on the line from Denver, fresh off his birthday celebration, this is Luis Scott-Vargas. Happy birthday, Luis.
It's actually not my birthday anymore. It was my birthday yesterday.
Am I late?
You are.
I'm sorry.
And therefore, your birthday wishes mean nothing.
Is that what the rule is?
You gotta wait another 364 days before you get another shot.
All right. I actually tried to be
Do
first.
not squander it.
I tried to be the first one to wish you happy birthday, and I
You actually
missed.
succeeded.
Oh, I did?
Yeah.
Sweet. You said I missed. You said close my nose cigar.
The only reason that I said you missed was I think a couple people who live in time zones wished me happy birthday before my birthday started, which in retrospect doesn't count.
No, not at all. So I did it.
Yeah.
Sweet. Now I feel good. So this week on the show, we're going to go into kind of a cool aspect of Oath of the Gatewatch, specifically in that we're going to talk about the colors of Oath of the Gatewatch and how they're a little different from what you would expect from colors traditionally. Namely, that they kind of have a whole lot going on within individual colors, and we're going to go deep onto that. Before we do, I want to remind you that Limited Resources is brought to you every week by channelfireball.com. I highly encourage you to check out their website for many things. One of the things that you can find there is awesome free content. You can get videos, podcasts like this one, and articles from some of the best players in the world that are all there to help you get better at Magic. And I know that that's what you want to do because you're here listening to this show. And if you want to, supplement that with even more awesome content, channelfireball.com is the place to go. All content completely free on Channel Fireball. Also, you want to check out Grand Prix. If you want to check out about Grand Prix Houston, gphouston.com is where to go. It's coming up quickly, just another week and a half or so from now, and we'll be in Houston covering Standard there for GP Houston. If you want to go, you're going to want to get pre-registered at gphouston.com. I also want to remind you that for those of you that had asked, the Limited Resources t-shirts are in stock at Channel Fireball as well. And I know that that was something that took a little while to get them back in stock, but they're there now. And
both the sleeveless and the normal ones.
No.
Oh wait, no, the normal ones can be turned into the sleeveless ones.
Yeah, actually, you can go sleeveless.
Strictly better.
Yes, but as they sit, no, they are. They do have sleeves on them, but all the sizes are available that we have, and you can get those there. They're real simple, but they're nice T-shirts with a cool little inner label as well. Also, the show is brought to you by you via the Patreon. You can support the show directly if you'd like via patreon.com/limited resources, and there's a lot of cool little perks there. And one of the really neat things that I like, this isn't necessarily related to the Patreon, but is with the LR community, and the Patreon supports that as well. And you get to have some conversations on there, but also there's the LR subreddit, which is, I've talked about it on the show a bunch of times, but it's a great little community on Reddit of LR listeners and people that are like-minded to probably how you think about the game and how you approach things. And one of the really neat things that's come out of that is that they have crowdsourced, so they've written these together, these guides for the flashback drafts on Magic Online. And so you can go to the subreddit, and at the top of the subreddit, it'll be sticky. You'll find a comprehensive, well-written guide that is going to, give you a foothold into the new formats or new to you formats. I know a lot of these, like, for example, I think it's Champions of Kamigawa block right now.
Triple Champions.
Which isn't that one of your favorites?
It's the champagne of limited formats.
You do love it though, right?
I do.
I'm not misremembering that.
I'm not even joking, even though it's not for everyone, just because there's a lot of weird stuff going on, and Champions itself was a notoriously strange set. So
okay, so keep that in mind. But
I'd recommend it, but yeah, it is a strange format.
Maybe tough to just jump in on it, or
yeah, part of it's that like there's a lot of the cards that ended up being good were kind of counterintuitive that they would be good, and it's super grindy. Like one of the big things that I love the draft was Soul Shift, which is like, there's a card called Crawling Filth, which I like to name alone, but it's a 6 mana 2/2 fear, and it has Soul Shift 5. So when it dies, it gets back a creature with a spirit to your hand of 5 cost or less. So when that dies, you get back your Scuttling Death, which is a 4/2 for 5 with Soul Shift 4. And when that dies, you get back your Gibbering Kami, which is a 2/2 flyer with Soul Shift 3 for 4 mana. And you just go down the chain.
And the chain
so all your creatures draw you a bunch of cards when they die, which is pretty sweet.
It does sound sweet. Anyway, if you want to check that out on the subreddit, there's links to it in the in the show notes for this episode, and you can get, an idea before you jump in cold and have an idea for what's going on. Another thing that you can get from the Patreon is you get to ask questions on the question of the week. And I think this is a really interesting one from our friend Mike Pierce, who says, can you compare and contrast Marshall and LSV's view on double queuing? He says, I completely see the rationale. Drafts are slow with a lot of dead time, especially Swiss, but I absolutely lose percentage points double queuing. Is it worth pursuing as a skill to get better to eliminate the dead time, or is it just too bad for win rate? Now, just to clarify, Mike is talking about when you play on Magic Online, when you enter 2 drafts at the same time, or 2 events at the same time of varying sorts, or in Luis's case, sometimes 3 at the same time, which I have seen you do on your stream. And the first thing I want to say about it is that Mike is correct. It is a skill, right? That, it's something that if you do want to get good at, you can practice that skill and you will improve at it. And I'll tell you what, the first time you try it, it is not fun. You are constantly having your attention pulled multiple directions, and you're playing Magic, one of the hardest games to play, and a pretty complex one. Now, I think that our views may differ on this, though, because I actually don't double queue on Magic Online basically ever. The only time I do is if it's on accident, and I don't enjoy it. It's really strange because you'd think I would actually be just the person to double queue, because like when I used to play online poker, I would play like 12 tables at once. And now, but when it comes to Magic, I find that I enjoy it a lot less if I'm double queuing. I also do worse. I think that Mike is correct that it does split your attention a bit. And so that's tough. And then on top of it, I hate being on the other end of a slow double queuer where you just know that they're sitting there playing their other match and they're just going to let your clock go down for a while and you just have to sit there and stare at it. And I don't like the idea of doing that to other people either. So what is your stance on double queuing, Luis?
So I would not actually recommend it. Like I would never say like, hey, in order to get better, you should double queue, because I don't think that's true. I do think I play worse when I double queue. I do it because there's so much dead time, and my attention is just like, I only have a finite amount of attention. My attention span is not as long as it could be. Also, yeah. I play really fast. I mean, that's just one of the things I tend to do. So frequently I'll be double queuing and have more time on my clock than either of my opponents. And that just means that, like, even when I'm playing a match, it just feels like my opponent's taking 2 minutes a turn, and I'm just like sitting there. Yeah. But I will admit that that double queuing is a kind of like a necessary evil. That's just how the program works. One of the things that I would recommend, well, if you only want to do drafts, it's tough because you either double queue or you play one and you wait between rounds. I have found constructed leagues to be a really good way to get around this, where if you join a modern, standard, or pauper league, or I guess Legacy's happening too, you get to play find and play a league match on demand, and they don't last very long. And leagues are not like super high stakes, like their entry fees aren't that high. It's like 8 tickets or something to join, I believe. It's 8, yeah. So, and you get to play 5 matches, so each individual match isn't worth a ton, which means that even if you're someone who hates double queuing, if your draft match ends, there's two matches still playing, 3 matches still playing. Go join your league match, and then if the draft all of a sudden starts round 2 really quickly, more than you expected, you could just concede out of the league match, and that's not the end of the world. Or you can go play in like the tournament practice room or casual room or whatever. There's a lot of different modes. When it comes to limited, though, you really are double queuing or are waiting, and you've got to find your own balance there. Like I said, I wouldn't recommend double queuing for getting better. I don't think that's actually all that useful, unless you want to learn to play under like tons of pressure. But I tend to find that fun, and I tend to want to do something in between rounds. So that's kind of how I'm led down that path. Yeah, I will also echo the leagues thing. I do that. I think that's great because I just don't care if I lose a league match, or if I'm in game 3 of my league match and my draft match starts, I'll play the last couple of minutes or just get a feel for, okay, if this game's going to go super long, then I'm out of here. But if it's going to be just a couple of minutes, I'm okay with that. That kind of thing I think isn't that disruptive, and I can usually do that pretty well. But yeah, when it comes to double queuing draft, it's a little different. All right, let us crack a pack, Luis. You have a note here on the pack, though. What did I note there? I forget already. If Oblivion Strike do again. Oh yeah, that's right. So somebody pointed out on Twitter that like our last 3 or 4 crack a packs have all had Oblivion Strikes that we've taken. So if this one does and we take it, we're just running it back because that is kind of boring. Like it is a reality of the format, so we're not going to ignore it. Well, one of the interesting things to then is just to go look at what would you take second pick if Strike wasn't there or something like that. Or just if you replace Strike with some bad common.
There you go. Yeah. So at any rate, I just don't want it to be mono Oblivion Strike. By the way, this pack came from Ryan. Thank you, Ryan.
I will give great thanks to, I can't remember who donated it, but whoever donated the alpha pack we used for the Crack-A-Pack with Andrew last week was...
I'm still waiting for you to send me the card so I can put them in the package that we send out. The Pack Fresh Alpha The Hive. Still waiting for it. Might have got lost in the mail. We'll see. But all right. First card up is Abstruse Interference. That's the Force Spike variant, and we have made it pretty clear that we don't like that card, and it's not on the docket here. Spark Mage's Gambit, the 1 in a red sorcery, deals 1 damage to each of up to 2 target creatures, and they can't block this turn. Not picking it first. I have ran it, though, and I don't know. I don't hate the card. I think it's fine.
If you have to main deck it, it's not a disaster, and it's a fine sideboard card. But it's more of a sideboard card than a main deck card.
Yeah, for sure. Core Scythe Master, 2 and a white, 3/1. When it attacks, when it's attacking, it has first strike.
I've taken this card pretty early. I would just not be very happy about it.
Agreed.
I think I third picked this card at the Pro Tour. Yeah, that was not great.
That sucks, but yeah, it is what it is. Kozilek's Translator's next. This guy's just been solid for me. The 4 and a black 3/5, and you can pay a life to add a colorless mana to your mana pool.
You know, it's been solid, but less good than Kozilek's Channeler by a decent amount. So not too surprising. The Channeler is a colorless card that obviously goes into it a lot, but yeah, it turns out paying the life is kind of relevant. I mean, the card is fine, but I'm not looking to take it this early.
Yeah, same thing. Ooh, here's a Saddleback Lagak, one of your favorites.
Lagak.
Get in the saddle. So, that's, of course, the 3 and a G, 3/1 with support 2. Yeah, that thing just performs.
Should have cost double green so it could be GG.
Yeah. Spawnbinder Mage is next.
Just to be clear, Saddleback's the pick so far.
Yes, for sure.
By a lot.
By a fair margin. Spawnbinder Mage is 3 and a white for a 2/4 human wizard ally, and you can tap it with you can cohort to tap a creature.
This card is fine. I tend to play the first Spawnbinder Mage in most of my white decks just because they naturally have a ton of allies, but it's not something I prioritize. It just costs 4 mana for a 2/4. You have to tap 2 creatures to tap one of their creatures. Like, it's not a high priority.
Agreed. I always view it as like a backup plan. Like if I draft, especially a black-white deck, those tend to get very diluted these days. You don't get just the pure black-white deck that has all the pieces you want and the removal and everything because everybody's fighting over that. And anybody that opens up an Isolation Zone or an Oblivion Strike, they're very likely to take it, and then they're going to think that they're the ones who are in that color, and the best color pair is the other color that you want to be in. So if you're trying to kind of force through black-white, you are going to come up with a pretty underpowered deck usually. And so what'll often happen is you end up with one Oblivion Strike or something like that, and you end up picking up a couple of other removal spells that are much more conditional than the really good removal. And Spawnbinder Mage ends up being sort of that third tier removal where you're like, well, at least if we get stalled out, I can not die to like some big Eldrazi or whatever because I'll be able to tap it with the Mage. Cinder Hellion, 4 and a red 4/4, and it does 2 damage to an opponent when it ETBs. I like that card. It's also got trample, by the way. I always forget it has trample.
I was going to say it's got trample.
Yeah, I always forget it has trample.
That's the best part of the card.
Yeah, it's solid. I mean, it's the 5, the 5 mana slot, right? We talk about this frequently, but with good reason. It gets filled, and you really don't get to just play as many 5-drops as you can. That said, if Cinder Hellion's one of my 5-drops, I'm fine with that. That card, when I've been trying to beat down, particularly in like a green-red strategy or a red-white strategy, has held its own for sure. Again, not exciting and not at a premium because it's a 5, but it's held its own.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we come back to, one of the concepts is this card above replacement value? Is it better than the average 5? And Cinder Hellion really isn't.
It's not. It's only a little below for me, though.
No, I'm not even saying it's below. I think it's just about average. Like,
yeah.
If you have to play a Cinder Hellion because you don't have another 5, that is perfectly fine. I don't even feel bad in the slightest about it. But cards like in that category, you just don't take early because there's so many replacements. So
especially at 5. That's just such a kicker. Unknown Shores.
So this is the colorless land, or it taps for a colorless, or you can pay 1 and tap it for any color. I like this card a lot. These lands have been creeping up in my pick orders just because of how easy it makes that to splash both the colorless cards that have activation or colorless costs, or another color, or potentially both. So I like them. I think that they kind of count as blue-black-ish cards because you're more likely to be those colors, but there's some value in them almost regardless of which color you end up. Don't play these in just like a random black-white deck that has no colorless needs, though. These lands aren't good in those decks. It's not like an Evolving Wilds. I'll play Evolving Wilds in a black-white allies deck, right? I'll just play 8-7 and then an Evolving Wilds, or sorry, 8-8 and an Evolving Wilds.
Mm-hmm.
Don't play Unknown Shores. You are paying a premium to get this color fixing, but in like a blue-black deck that has multiple Blinding Drones, the card is great. It's fantastic.
Yeah,
and it's a card that I like having in an option to take early because it just opens the range of cards you can take. That being said, I'm not taking it over Saddleback.
Right. One other point about Unknown Shores to keep in mind, specifically with Unknown Shores, is that if you are going to splash cards planning to use Unknown Shores to cast them, the cheaper they are, the more likely it is that your Unknown Shores will actually be able to cast them. So keep that in mind. If you're trying to splash a 5 or a 6 drop with Unknown Shores, you're a lot more, basically you have to have another, it's effectively adding a mana to the cost of whatever you're splashing. So if it's 2 or 3 mana, you can use an Unknown Shores pretty reliably in an average game to cast it. But if
like
it's 6 or 7,
Touch of the Void in your blue-black deck off like a pair of Unknown Shores and a red-black dual land sounds great.
No problem.
But trying to splash like a Birthing Hulk off an Unknown Shores is a little
disaster. Yeah,
I do like splashing the card Birthing Hulk.
Agreed. Another card that comes to mind for that is like a Reflector Mage, right? Like that's a nice little splash that you can fit in with an
Reflector Mage, the best unplayable card in the set.
I know, it's so sad, and it's funny because I actually bring it up because of how often it's splashed.
What we're referring to, by the way, is that blue-white is
just god awful.
I think 10th if you had to look at the color pairs.
Yeah.
In terms of how likely I am to draft it. But go on. What do we have next?
Next is Sweep Away. So that's the 2 and a blue instant, return target creature to its owner's hand, and you can put it on top of their library if that creature happens to be attacking. Why is this card not lived up?
I think we overrated it.
Okay. I want to know why though. Like I look at it and even now I read it and I think this is fine. This is a reasonable card.
It is a fine card. I'll play it in a lot of my decks, but it's a conditional card. It's a control card. Like you just don't want this unless you expect to be the player getting attacked a lot more often. And that just limits who can play it. Like, Immolating Glare, 1 and a white, destroy an attacking creature, is cheap enough and effective enough that it ends up being a decent amount better than Sweep Away, even though they fill similar roles. So,
all right.
I would take Saddleback over Sweep Away. I would take Unknown Shores over Sweep Away too, honestly, this early. So
I would too. Card that I've really liked, Seer's Lantern. The 3 colorless taps to add a colorless, and you can pay 2 generic mana, tap it, and scry 1. Look, this isn't a high pick, right? This isn't a high impact card, but God, it has just pulled its weight for me, man. I think it just hits that replacement level right where you want it to be. And I got to tell you, there is no more miserable feeling in the format than getting into a board stall or where both players are top decking and nobody's making progress and your opponent has a Seer's Lantern and you're just watching them just, scry lands to the bottom and draw more spells. I mean, I've lost games to that like multiple times where I'm just sitting there staring at my opponent. I'm like, yep. And then I draw my card and, it's an island and I'm go ahead. And they're like scry and, I'm just like, oh no. And, it really does have that utility in the late game that matters.
Yeah, I have not found myself playing this in decks that don't need colorless mana very often. Like the vast majority of the times I play this are in a deck that has a Blinding Drone or a Spatial Contortion.
That is where it shines, yeah,
or what have you. Marshall, it shines because it's a lantern.
By the way, I heard Ochoa say that Spine of Ishtar was going to be a real backbreaker on PSL, and I lost it.
Yeah, that was great. But I think this is a good card in the most control decks. It's also a decent sideboard card. I've cited this in a number of times. Like, if I have a kind of like a mid-rangey deck and I play against a mid-range or a control deck where I expect the games to go long, then it can do some work. Basically, the longer the game goes, the better this goes because you have the time to spend these resources on a kind of, a minor effect, but a repeatable minor effect over a bunch of turns is still very good. So,
yeah, totally.
I like Seer's Lantern. I would take it over Unknown Shores, I believe. But I would not take it over Saddleback.
Right. I'm still on Saddleback. Now we're going to hit the uncommons, and we have a competition here. And by the way, no Oblivion Strike, so yay. Embodiment of Insight is our first uncommon. So we talked about the 5-drop slot. This one is 4 and a green, but this one's packed some real punch. It's a 4/4 Vigilance that gives land creatures you control Vigilance, and you can landfall to turn one of your creatures or one of your lands into a 3/3 elemental until end of turn with haste.
It's no Embodiment of Fury, the red one, but it's still quite good.
Yeah. Now, do you think Saddleback's better?
I actually think the embodiment's better, just because it's such a high impact 5-drop. I think it's close, but I think I'd just go with the embodiment.
Okay, well, I'll keep those 2 green cards in the maybe pile. Now, here's a question that comes up pretty often, at least for me, is Cliffhaven Vampire.
Oh, so, well, here we go. This is 2/4 flying for 2 white/black, and it's an ally, and then it also says whenever you gain life, your opponent loses 1 life. So it doesn't scale up. Like if you gain 5, they still lose 1, but it's still just a repeatable ping effect. You know, a lot of the times it attacks for 2 plus an additional 1 every turn, so it does 3 damage a turn, which is great. It's also a 2/4 flyer, which is great. It's also an ally in black/white, which does a lot of what you want. So I would take Cliffhaven Vampire here.
So I wouldn't currently. I think it is the best card, though. But I am just so not into fighting the fight for black-white. I have definitely found myself in that scrum and not felt good about it lately in 8/4s. And I've been drafting a lot, and I'm just like, the cat's been out of the bag for a long time that black-white's the best color pair. But again, there seems to be this thing because the 2 best commons are in those 2 colors and they're like premium cards that people immediately start gravitating towards this color pair. And I'm now of the opinion that I don't want to move in on it like with a gold card like this that's very committing, like Cliffhaven Vampire. I'm more likely to take one of those 2 other cards that we mentioned because I can go at least some other directions from there. But here I'm taking embodiment, at least from what we've seen so far.
All right. I think that's reasonable. I don't think that's a bad pick. I think Cliffhaven Vampire is enough better that I'm willing to take Cliffhaven Vampire knowing that I won't always play it.
That you might not play it, sure. Storm Chaser Mage is next. That's the red-blue 1/3 flyer with haste and prowess.
Great card. It's not as good as Cliffhaven Vampire. Even though it's a slightly easier to draft color combination, I would still take Vampire over it.
Oh, totally. I think the one thing to keep in mind, too, with Storm Chaser Mage is that prowess doesn't trigger in limited as often as you probably think it does. It will a few times, but if you lay out your decks and you look at all the non-creature spells, you're usually playing between 5 to 8, something in that range, maybe 4, maybe 6. And that means that, on your average game, you're going to trigger it once or maybe twice. And that's not great. Now the truth is, if you can cast it, if you're just straight blue-red, a 1/3 flying haste that has this random upside is good. So you're going to play it anyway, but you have to keep that kind of thing in check. All right, here's a good rare to contrast against our Saddleback, Embodiment, and Cliffhaven Vampire. It's Oath of Chandra.
Oh, so, well, yeah. That one's quite good. It's an enchantment for 1 and a red, and then when it comes into play, deal 3 damage to target creature an opponent controls. It also has
lots of flavor text.
A bunch of flavor text where at the end of it, each turn, if you played a planeswalker that turn, deal 2 damage to your opponent. But I would just take Oath of Chandra here, I think.
I would too.
It's just too efficient. It's 2 mana to deal 3. And that's a great deal.
I'm on it too. Yeah, I think that you just don't get removal of that quality anymore. We used to get it for 1 mana cheaper at instant speed that could hit players at common.
It's not fair to compare it to Lightning Bolt because
why not? It was an high watermark.
Yeah, I think Lightning Strike is the better comparison because that's been in so many more sets. That's
fair enough.
1 red instant deal 3 to creatures or players, and this is much worse than that, but it's still very good.
Yeah, exactly. But it is comparable enough that you would take it in, and I would take Lightning Strike out of this pack if it was in it too. Okay, so Oath of Chandra is our pick for the Crack-A-Pack. Now that leads us into our main discussion, and I kind of teased it at the beginning of the show that we're talking about kind of an interesting scenario that we have here that doesn't normally pop up, which is that in Oath of the Gatewatch, each color seems to have cards within that color that are kind of seeded in there for certain types of decks. And there seems to be, at least for most of the colors, 2 paths that you can go down, which leads to these really interesting draft scenarios where one player can be in a color and pass maybe like a first pick quality card for like a 7th pick quality card in their color, like in the same exact color, and even be fine with that, right? Which is weird. The example that came to mind was, you could pass something like a Blinding Drone, which is, up in the first through third pick quality card for something like a Dwar Avenger, which is a much lower pick than that, if you're in the Surge deck. Because if you're not going to activate a Blinding Drone, like if you don't have any colorless mana, that card's just dead to you. You don't even care about it. But a Dwar Avenger might be, one of the Surge cards that you're looking for, even though it's a much lower pick. And you're like, oh, I'll take this Dwar Avenger. Even though it's weird when you kind of pause yourself there, because you're like, hold on a second, I'm in blue, and I'm passing a first pick quality card that is also blue. That's weird. And that's not the kind of thing that you would expect from a normal draft format. And so we wanted to, kind of go into how that goes for Oath of the Gatewatch, because it kind of makes it interesting. Because, we saw it at the Pro Tour, like you can share colors with your immediate neighbor, yet both slot into two different styles of decks within those colors and be actually fine with it, which is really weird. Because normally if you're sharing colors with your neighbor, you're pretty unhappy about it.
Right. So there's a couple things that we're trying to accomplish here. One is, like you said, be cognizant and realize that you could be blue getting passed to by blue and still be okay with that. Mm-hmm. You'd still rather the person passing you be a different color, but if you're going after different sets of cards, then it's fine. It can be open. Which actually, to bring up the Pro Tour as an example, Paulo Vitor was passing to Huey Jensen.
Yeah, that was the thing I was thinking of. They're both blue-red. They
crazy. Were both blue-red, but Huey's drafting just a straight-up Surge deck. He had 6 slip-through space in his deck.
And he ran all 6, by the way.
Oh, yeah. And Paulo was drafting a more colorless-focused control deck. And both of them ended up with really good decks. I saw both their decks, and I thought they were great. I didn't even realize they were sitting next to each other at the time.
Yeah, they both had a Jorian, which is kind of funny.
So the second thing, though, is to know how the part of your color is that you're drafting pairs with another color. Because if you're drafting, say, going back to the colorless theme, if you start with the blue colorless theme, knowing which other colors that pairs with and why is very important. And that's how you end up with color combinations like blue-white being undraftable, or color combinations like blue-black being very different from draft to draft, or blue-red.
Yeah, totally. And, one of the really cool things that we're going to dive into as we get into these colors as well, Luis, is, well, what about the cards that go in both of the strategies within that color? Because all of a sudden those skyrocket in value, right? Like those are all become a very hot commodity if you're in blue and there's a blue card that you want as the colorless drafter and the Surge player wants as well.
Right. It's important to identify the cards that bridge the gap and are good cards. There are some cards that are playable in both but aren't really that high picks. But there are cards like Boulder Salvo, right, which is Oblivion Strike, Isolation Zone. These are clearly cards that you're always going to play and they're always going to be great. So identifying those. It's good to know part of why they're good. Or you have a card like Vampire Envoy, which is a little less obvious that it's one of those cards, but it is. Yep. Every black deck wants Vampire Envoy. It's just a great card.
Totally. Yeah. And I think that those ones that hit that cross section, we'll be focusing on those as well. All right. So let's get into these colors here to get a little bit finer detail into what we're talking about. We're going to start with white, Luis, which does have, you'll see that most of the colors, in fact, from our little study here, 4 of the 5 colors have basically 2 different strategies that they're going for. So break down white for us. What's the first strategy that jumps to mind when you think of white?
So the loudest strategy in white is the kind of allies cohort like synergies, and these are slightly defensive cohorts, and by definition defensive ability or by nature defensive, just because it requires tapping 2 creatures, so therefore not attacking with them unless they have vigilance. And it's best common in this, besides Isolation Zone. That Isolation Zone is just everyone just wants that card. But besides Isolation Zone, Undo War Cleric is the best of the bunch here. This is the 2/2 that has cohort gain 2 life. And one of the reasons Undo War Cleric is great is because it goes in all kinds of white decks, because it's also a 2/2 for 2, which is awesome. But the allies cohort part of white, this has Spawnbinder Mage, Heifer Protector, Makindi Aeronaut, like the 2-mana 1/3 flyer. Like these are. They tend towards being defensive, and they tend towards being a controlling game. And one of the reasons that white is one of the better colors is that the second part of white is which sounds like the opposite. This is the curve out support aggro deck, but a lot of the cards overlap really well. Like we said, onto War Cleric, the uncommon allied reinforcements that makes 2 2/2s for 4. They're allies. It works well in both decks. Core Sky Climber, the 3/2 for 3 that you can pay 1 white to give flying. That card is good in both the black-white deck and like the white-green or white-red decks, because In the curve out deck, it's just a good 3-drop that can hit in for damage later. And in the defensive deck, it's a 3-drop that can get flying later in a board stall. So it's nice that white has a lot of dual use cards. So this breakdown for white is actually less relevant than it is for some of the other colors, just because
but still, I agree, but you can still get a feel for where those cards really want to be, even if they're good enough to be in the other decks. For example, with the curve out support aggro theme, Relief Captain's one of the best cards you can have in that deck. And when you put that into the cohort deck, it's very good, right? Like, you're never cutting it. You're probably going to take it high just because of its raw power level, but it doesn't fundamentally play with the theme other than that it's an ally, right? You're playing it because, like, I guess it makes your guys better blockers, or maybe it can be a finisher that you can use to start attacking with some creatures or whatever. But the allies and cohort deck is actually quite happy to just sit back. Like, if nobody attacked for the game, they would have a huge advantage. And so, you'll often find that deck just passing the turn with creatures up ready to activate them after sort of threatening to block, right? And so, while again, the Relief Captain will perform well enough and they're just on raw power level, it doesn't synergize with it. Another card that comes along with that and is a good example is Shoulder to Shoulder, right? In the Allies deck, Shoulder to Shoulder is like, whatever. You can play it if you want, but it's not a key piece to the puzzle at all. But in the curve out support aggro style decks, it's a player. Like, it's a 3 that you actually want to have in your deck so that you can keep that pressure going and get your creatures big enough to keep attacking. So yeah, I find that the contrasts there are pretty interesting, though I agree with you that they're not quite as strong as they are in some of the other colors as well.
Right, and then there are some cards that end up being pretty polarizing, like Core Scythe Master is actually one of them. You will play it in black-white, but it's really not that great because it's just such a poor blocker.
In the Allies deck, yeah.
Right, but it's great in the green-white or red-white aggressive decks.
Yeah, totally. And I think the one you brought up, too, is even a little further closer, which is Core Sky Climber, which is, good enough to play in the black-white deck because it says ally and it costs 3 mana and it's a serviceable body, but, you'd rather be beating down with it, too.
So one of the big takeaways for me for white is that it's a really safe color to go into, because we named black, white, green, white, and red, white, and those are all great decks. Again, blue, white is not. Blue, white just has so little support, and because of what we're going to talk about later, none of the blue and white themes actually just line up in really any way. Mm-hmm. So that's why blue, white tends to be a fairly undrafted deck. It's not even underdraft. It's just you shouldn't draft it very often. There are some times when it is right to draft blue, white. I'm not saying you can't draft it, but whereas every draft should have 1 to 2 black-white drafters, I think there's not every draft should have a blue-white drafter. And I don't know what the actual number is, but it's probably like, half or a third of drafts should have a blue.
0.4.
Yeah, there we go. But look at white can combine with all 3 other colors besides blue, and white's cards are flexible enough that you're not really taking much of a risk. If you start with Undead War Clerics, Core Sky Climber, Shoulder to Shoulder, there's no card that you can't take and end up with a pretty good deck. Like, every single color has cards that you're interested in there.
Totally. Yeah, that's a great takeaway, because when we look forward, we'll see that that's not always the case. That the cards can go so well into both decks. And
this is why, the next color we're going to talk about is blue. And yeah, blue's great. I love blue. I actually think drafting blue is very good. But blue puts so many more restrictions on you. It's kind of like, you would rather take the single green card over the black-white card first pick in the Crack-a-Pack. Mm-hmm. One of the advantages of taking a white card over a blue card is you're just going to play it a vast majority of the time.
Yeah,
whereas
totally.
when you first pick up Blinding Drone, the card is great. I think it's better than any common in white that is not Isolation Zone.
Right.
But you get to play Blinding Drone, like, I don't know, 50% of the time when you first pick it, or less, just because you not only have to be blue, you also have to have color sources. Yeah,
and that's one of the overarching things that has really come about, and I think it'll come out as we go further into this, is just, I talk about setup cost on a card-by-card basis, but it also works for strategies, for, draft archetypes. And, man, it's so weird because you'll have this kind of nagging feeling in the back of your head when you're about to make a pick, and you're just going like, well, I hope I pick up a bunch of colorless lands as well. Where when you pick Cliffhaven Vampire or an Ondu War Cleric, you're just like, sweet, this goes in my deck. Next, right? You just don't have to take on that extra burden. So the question becomes, well, is that extra burden worth it? And it can be, but it isn't always. So I think that's a really interesting wrinkle that we have in Oath of the Gatewatch that we didn't before. So let's move on to blue, Luis, and start diving into this one, because this one definitely has 2 very different colors, themes going on. And the first one is colorless, which you just mentioned.
Yeah, and this is Blue's biggest theme for sure.
Yes.
It's the loudest, it's the one that's the most numerous, and it's the one that Blue gets most of its strength, because Blinding Drone and Cultivator Drone, the 1/3 tapper and the 2/3 that taps for a colorless, but you can only use it for colorless cards or activated of colorless abilities on colorless cards. These cards are both great. I've first picked Blinding Drone many times, been happy with that. I've first picked Cultivator Drone, less happy about that, but third picking Cultivator Drone is usually pretty good. So these are both great cards. They just don't fit into every single deck. And
I mean, they don't fit that well into any other deck.
No.
Right? If you can't do anything with the colorless mana from Cultivator Drone or use your Blinding Drone, then they're just bricks. I mean, they don't do anything.
Right.
Which is really weird. That's such a big range, because Blinding Drone could be the first or second best card in your blue whatever deck that has colorless, mana available to it. It could be like your best card in your deck could be that. And at the same time, if you don't get the colorless mana, it's in the sideboard. It's a very big range.
It's funny because if let's assume you had a deck where getting colorless mana is trivial, right? You just have great amount of color sources. You never get screwed on it. Blinding Drone is comparable to Boulder Salvo. It's even very close to Oblivion Strike and Isolation Zone.
Exactly.
But there are some decks you're just like, well, I'm this blue-red aggro deck.
Yeah.
Don't have any colorless sources.
Nope.
I guess Blinding Drone's in the sideboard.
Yeah.
Or you'll play it with like 1 to 2 colorless sources, and it's just a 2-mana 1/3, which is isn't the end of the world. And sometimes it's on, but mostly it's not.
Right. It's just that you can't help but think of the potential being squandered there. Now, before we go on to the other side of blue, I did have a question about what we just talked about with that, that feeling that you get when you're going to take a card that has a setup cost that might not come together for you. From a design standpoint or from like a draft standpoint, is the payoff supposed to be that you get these later? Like that you don't have to pick them super early because other people are going to be scared or just not in those colors that they're not going to be able to activate it? Is that the check and balance on cards like this? Is that I'm supposed to get a first pick quality card like Blinding Drone 4th or 5th because other people are like, I don't want to deal with this whole colorless mana thing?
It's certainly part of it. It's easier to cut the colorless theme than it is to cut a whole color. And you could be drafting blue, like you said, and someone to your left or two to your left could be drafting blue and still be passing you these cards.
Yeah.
Part of it, too, is these cards are just really good. When they do work, they're great. Mm-hmm. Blinding Drone's a great card. A 3-mana 2/3 Cultivator Drone that taps for a mana, that's a great card.
Very good card.
So if they're on, they're high enough payout that they're worth some amount of risk, certainly. Just because they are higher quality than a lot of if you assume that these cards are on, then blue has 2 really high quality commons in these 2 cards. But the risk is that they don't always work. There is enough support that I would say let's say you end at the end of the draft, you knew you were going to be blue, you can take these cards pretty confidently. Like if your first 4 picks are blue cards, and then you see one of these cards 5th, let's say Cultivator Drone, that's a little more realistic. Mm-hmm. You're pretty safe taking it. Because the blue decks end up with a colorless theme, like I would say, 3/4 of the time or something like that.
Yeah, I agree. All right. You mentioned Blinding Drone, Cultivator Drone. Prophet of Distortion has become one of my favorite cards in the set as well, and that's another one that does really well in the late game if you have the colorless.
I love Prophet of Distortion. I've been really impressed with that card.
Me too. I think it's great. I first picked it multiple times. What about the other half of blue?
See, the other half of blues, it's kind of weird. It's a little harder to draft in my experience.
Yes.
I'm still trying to get a good handle on it, honestly. This is the Surge deck. This is the deck that the nominal payoff is that you get to cast some cheap spells. You get to cast your Jwar Isle Avengers for 3 mana. You get to cast your Containment Remembrance for 1 mana, though that's pretty easy to do. You also get to combine with red and cast like Goblin Free Blades for 2 mana, right? Because you're enabling it with your Expedites and Slip Through Spaces. And even this is where Prophet of Distortion is kind of sweet. It's a 1 mana spell. But I haven't found that the blue-red tempo deck is like that easy to get because it relies on so many specific cards. So the second half of blue, the Surge half, is one that I feel you shouldn't go into all that often. I haven't been in love with it.
It's funny because it hits these 2 opposites for me. So it hits one really big high for me, which is that I love tempo type strategies. Mana War's my favorite card. I love the idea of being able to, develop my board faster than my opponent or while setting my opponent back potentially. And the Surge deck absolutely has sequences that give you that it clicks that part of my brain and I'm like, oh, this is sweet. I'm just going off here or whatever. And then the other end of the spectrum is exactly what I hate, which is decks that are very finicky, right? Like you need to make sure you get all your pieces.
In the wrong order.
Yeah, I drew my cards in the wrong order. Exactly. And even in the draft section where it's like, I didn't get any slip through spaces. I don't have any cheap enablers for these cards. So now they're kind of mediocre to bad versions of cards I would have played anyway. And it makes the consistency kind of go out the door. So it's funny because, I mean, I don't expect to have my cake and eat it too here, but it is weird that it pulls me hard in a direction I really want to go while also like repelling me with something that I hate, which is, really inconsistent decks and limited. It's a real love-hate with this deck.
Part of the thing too is like, the payoff for drafting Cohort is that your creatures tap to do really good things. The payoff drafting Colorless is you have some very powerful effects. The payoff for drafting Surge is that you get a discount on your cards. But how often are you getting a noticeable discount? Like the best case scenario for Jwar Avenger is playing it for 3 mana. And that's hard to do unless you go to our old friend the Bonesaw.
Your old friend,
underrated player to be sure, but let's just say you can't handle the Bonesaw. Then if you're casting an Expedite or a Slip Through Space into a Jwar Avenger, you got a 1 mana discount. That's not mind-boggling.
Not that great,
and it also falls off later in the game. Let's say you have a perfect Surge Enabler deck. Once you get to like turn 7 or 8, like you could play your guy for 5 or you could play it for 3, and either way it does the same thing. Yeah. It's not like it's more powerful. It's still just a 3/3 flyer, which is fine, certainly, but Surge just falls off really late. Things have to come up in the right order early. Like there are turns that are great from Surge, and it is a cool mechanic, and it is a mechanic that sometimes, leads to some really good sequences. But I think the Surge deck is largely a function of, do you have Jory N? Do you have Pyromancer Assault? These are the cards that really pay you.
The big payoffs.
Jwar Avenger doesn't really pay you. It's a fine card. You can include it in almost every blue deck and be happy with it. But you cheating it out for 1 mana cheaper, it's not like you did it. You did not wreck your opponent. So
no. But Boulder Salvo does feel like that when you get that turn
like
right.
That, yes, but the problem with Boulder Salvo is everyone wants it. So you don't get 3 Boulder Salvos in most decks, and therefore you shouldn't be building around it. So the Surge part of blue is kind of, I consider it a sub-theme. I consider it something you can go into, but not something that locks you in any way to that theme. Like, I think Containment Memory is a great card. I play it in all my blue decks. I think Jwar Avenger, Grip of the Royal, these are fine cards. Slip Through Space is a card you can often just play because it just costs you so little to include it in your deck.
Yeah.
But really blue is the colorless theme, and the blue combinations I found the most success with are the ones that respect that. So I've actually been kind of up on blue-green lately.
Look at you.
Look, we had Andrew Cuney on last week. He sung the praises of it, and I tried it a couple times, and I was like, all right, this is actually a thing. So if I'm blue, I'm almost always colorless. Not always, but almost always. And if I'm colorless, I'm looking to be blue-black most of the time, followed by blue-red, followed by blue-green. Also, blue-red has the Surge sub-theme. So blue has a lot of stuff going on besides just the colorless theme, but know that the colorless theme is the biggest part of blue, and you're most likely going to be it, though you can draft blue without having it.
Okay. Let's move on to black. The headliner for black is the deck that we talked about with white when you pair it with white traditionally, and that's the Allies Cohort deck.
That is certainly, again, the loudest part of black is that black-white, first of all, because it's the best deck, or it seems to be the best deck. And second of all, because so many of the black cards are allies and or have cohort. It's mostly that they're allies, actually. There aren't that many black creatures with cohort. They're mostly enablers for cohort. Mm-hmm. But besides Oblivion Strike, as we've said many times, that's just the best black common. Every deck wants it. But besides that, you have a lot of support for the controlling black-white cohort deck. And black can actually manage this theme by itself. You can actually end up with a deck that has Malakir Soothsayer, the 4/4 that taps to draw a card and lose a life.
Which is a house, by the way.
Yeah, the card is less good than it looks, I believe, but it's still good.
Oh, I think it's great.
Yeah.
I have it in premium uncommon territory.
I have it a bit below that. I have not been, wowed by it. I find it to be decent, but not insane.
Interesting.
But Vampire Envoy is the real winner here. Vampire Envoy is just great.
That card's fantastic.
The 1/4 flyer that when it taps you gain a life, and it just enables all your cards. Also, I want to mention Zulaport Tidmage. You predicted I would play 2.5 after we talked about how bad it was.
Yeah.
And in my Pro Tour deck, I had 2 in the main deck, 1 in the sideboard, and I sided it in multiple times. So that's not 2.5. I don't know what is.
We did it. That's great.
So Chain Mage is a special case in that I think you want it in black-white, but only black-white. I have not found a deck other than that wants it.
Yeah, the blue-black deck that you like definitely doesn't want it.
So black has this allies theme going, but it's a lighter touch than white, and that's important to know. It means that if you're black and you have 2 Vampire Envoys, looking to pair it with Ondu War Clerics and Spawnbinder Mages is great, right? You should be aware of that's a great possibility. But also know that you can go into black-blue or black-red or black-green. Black actually can pair with every color in a decent way, though I have found black-red to be the worst of those. And I would prioritize, if I'm drafting black, I would prioritize taking white cards followed by taking blue cards followed by taking green cards followed by taking red cards. Those are kind of like the order I have of the black archetypes.
That makes sense. I've tried black-red early in the format, and it looked to me like it had a lot of promise, and it's just completely fallen off. I haven't drafted in it forever, and I don't play against it hardly ever either.
We're right, and I think that's, as we may have mentioned in previous episodes, the black-red aggro deck is really just the red aggro deck with a couple black cards because it just needs 3 or 4 colorless lands to work. So it means that if I'm drafting,
I thought Sky Scour was going to be a thing.
Yeah, it basically isn't.
But it's just not,
It is sometimes in blue-black aggro, but that's a very rare deck.
Yeah, I have heard of that, though.
So the lens at which we're looking at color combinations here, by the way, is when we're discussing black, it's like, what if you start with 3 black cards? What should you be looking to do? And we're trying to give you the tools to make good decisions there. And the second part of that is black's colorless strategy, which is very prominent as well. So you have cards like Essence Depleter. This is one of the great ones. This is the 2/3, the uncommon, the 2/3 for 3 that you pay 1 and a colorless to drain your opponent for 1. Havoc Sower, the 3/3 uncommon that you pay 1 and a colorless to get +2/+1. And then Kozilek Streaker, which I have been very impressed with as well at common, the 3/2 that you pay a colorless to get +1/+7 Intimidate. So you've got a decent amount of these black cards that care about colorless mana. And those naturally, if you have those, you should be more looking to pair with blue because blue has such a big colorless payout. The one exception I found is Essence Depleter. I found that the Black-White Allies deck loves playing Essence Depleter with a couple colorless lands. This is where the Seer's Lantern really comes in handy because you're already controlling and want to go to the long game. Essence Depleter works so well with all your stalling ally cards.
Card is a ridiculous card, by the way.
Yeah. Black is just interesting because it's got a light allies theme and a slightly heavier colorless theme, and they don't necessarily mesh all that well, but black also just has a ton of options. So figuring out where you're going with black is always interesting because if you have the allies, you should be looking more to pair with white. If you have the colorless cards, I more like pairing with blue or green. Yeah,
and we mentioned at the beginning too about maybe bringing up a few of the cards that are sort of those crossroads cards, the cards that go well into either deck. And sure, I think that our listenership knows that Oblivion Strike is going to go into any of these decks. That the removal and such is obvious, but there are a few cards
let's not insult the listener by bringing up Oblivion Strike again. I think
right. But you know what I mean. There's cards that'll go no matter what. But like the one I think that you brought up, when you first started talking about it was Vampire Envoy, which looks like it's like, oh, well, that one probably goes in the Allies version because it has this sort of tap synergy, but it actually just goes into any deck that plays black. And so that's one that has gone up a lot as a real, crossover card that can go into either deck and really any deck that can cast it and do good work.
Yeah, Vampire Envoy is just awesome. It's just one of the premium commons.
Yeah.
This is one of the commons. When I see a 4th pick Vampire Envoy, I think black is open.
Yep.
It is that good. It really is. So I like drafting black. I feel like black lends itself well to 2 different control decks, which I'm a fan of.
So that's blue-black and green-black?
Well, white-black.
White-black. Oh, you consider that a control deck. Interesting.
I think white-black's a control deck.
No, it is. You're right. I hadn't considered it that way, but it is.
And I think that the colorless deck is the other control deck, and that can be white, blue-black, or black-green, though blue-black is more.
Okay, gotcha.
And we'll talk more about the green deck specifically when we get to green. Are we doing green today, or maybe we're just going to call it at black and...
No, we're gonna go to red and green, and then we'll call it a show after that.
All right, we're gonna do all the colors.
Yes, all 5 of them.
So tell us about your favorite deck, the Red Surge deck.
Yeah, well, so this does move us on to red, and red does tend to break up into 2 rough groups here. I would say the first one is the Surge deck. We've talked about it already. This is combining the super cheap spells with the Surge cards and trying to get those payoffs. So, one of the big ones is Boulder Salvo, and the Surge deck does get to take advantage of Boulder Salvo more than other decks. The problem is those other decks will take a Boulder Salvo just the same, and they'll say, yeah, occasionally I'll get to pay the Surge, but whatever else, I'll just play it anyway. And so you don't really, get those falling into your hands just because you happen to be the Surge player. But like Expedite, which isn't a good card, but it's a deck that goes only in the Surge deck and really nowhere else. But the other payoffs that you see more commonly are like Goblin Free Runner. That's a big one for this deck. Pyromancer's Assault is a build around me uncommon that you can take and will go in this deck, and this is where it really shines. Cards like Reckless Bushwhacker, and even cheap effective spells like Reality Hemorrhage and Zada's Commando end up being cards that you really want in this type of deck, even though both Reality Hemorrhage and Zada's Commando also fit that description of those Crossroads cards that other decks also want. Zada's Commando's, the best 2-drop in red. And so, you're going to see fights over that, which means that even if you're in the Surge deck and you see something like a Goblin Free Runner, you very well may be incentivized to just take the Zada's Commando anyway, because, it's just a better card in general. But also, even if you're trying to maximize synergies, a card like Zada's Commando is going to help you do that by only costing 2 mana, because hey, you're gonna hit turn 4 and sometimes go Zada's Commando, Goblin Free Runner, go, and that's a hell of a turn, or Zada's Commando, Boulder Salvo, or whatever. So that's one version of the deck, and then the other one is it kind of covers multiple different archetypes, but all under the guise of being an aggressive deck, basically in a deck that wants to beat down. And that can be an allies one that, you get some synergies with like a card like Akum Flameseeker or something along those lines. This tends to pair best with white, I found, and you can make a pretty aggressive white-red deck, which I don't think is the best place to be, but it's decent. That deck can beat down and it has all the tools it needs to win. Or you can go colorless. And, we mentioned a minute ago, but like the deck that I think of with that is black-red. Colorless, but that deck really just hasn't come together. So I don't know. Does it pair up with any other colorless, any other color for the colorless deck in your mind?
It's honestly almost mono red, just because the colorless part is a second color, if you will. Just because when you're a control deck, you can wait a couple turns. First of all, you can wait a couple turns on hitting the colorless source, right, for your blinding drone, or definitely your Prophet of Distortion or Essence Deplete or what have you. Also, the control decks like to play Hedron Crawler, the 2-mana 0/1 that taps for a colorless, and you have blue a lot of the time for Cultivator Drone, which can also give you extra colorless sources that isn't really beating them down at all. Right. The aggro deck can't wait as much on those, just because it needs its Kozilek Streakers to be getting intimidated on turn 4 when it wants to attack past a 2/2. Or it really needs to be able to make its mob Kozileks into a 4-power creature when it's hitting, because that's the point of the card. Mm-hmm. So you have this need for colorless sources sooner, combined with the inability to play crawlers and cultivator drones because they just don't fit in the deck or are the wrong color, which means that you need more colorless lands. You want sometimes 5 colorless lands, 6 colorless lands, which means that you can't play 2 colors unless you have a significant amount of black-red fixing or red whatever fixing. So that's why I lean more towards the closer to mono red version, which also just doesn't come together as often. So largely I've been unimpressed with the really colorless heavy aggro decks. You can have aggro decks that are devoid, that have a bunch of creatures that happen to be colorless, because then Swarm Surge gets on. Mm-hmm. But that's much less difficult to do than a deck that literally needs colorless mana. And that's kind of what we're talking about here.
Yeah. Yeah. So, red seems to be split, but not quite as split. And it is a little confused, right? Like there doesn't seem to be a supernatural home for red here. Right.
I think the most common place you'll see red is in an allies deck, but it's also fine. Boulder Salvo is just a great card. It's a good addition to any deck. One of the things that really helps red, I believe, first of all, Boulder Salvo is great, goes everywhere. Second of all, Zada's Commando actually is also great and goes everywhere.
It's
just
really good.
All the red decks just want Zada's Commando, and maybe a blue-red control deck doesn't want it, but even then, a 2/1 First Striker is a great blocker. It keeps back everything. So between that and Akum Flameseeker, which a card I found is consistently underrated, this is the 3/2 that cohorts to discard a card and then draw a card. This card, I think, is quite good. And it's not that hard to get allies. I believe you should be playing a Coon Flameseeker in almost all your red decks. So having like 2.5 commons that fit everywhere, with a Flameseeker being, maybe a little closer to half than a full card, because if you don't have any other allies, it really just is a 3/2, means that red's not so committal. It's kind of like white in that regard. I think white is deeper, which is why white ends up being a bit more popular. But even then, if you start with some red cards, if you do first pick a Boulder Salvo, second pick Zada's Commando, you can kind of go in any direction. You can take green cards and draft like a green-red beatdown deck. You can take white cards, draft a white-red ally beatdown deck. You can take blue cards and draft either like a Surgish deck, which I think is less likely than just kind of like a blue-red mid-range control deck, which work perfectly fine. And lastly, you can take black cards. Like I'm not looking to take Vampire Envoy after taking Boulder Salvo Zada's Commando. I just don't feel that combination of cards works out all that well.
No, I agree. And like I said, one of the cards that I was really down on and then really up on was, or not really up on, but at least caught my eye, was Sky Scourer, and it's kind of just fallen off for me too. I think my initial read on it was better than the hopefulness that I saw after seeing it in like week 1 of the format. All right, that moves us to green, and green is the most confusing, I will say, of the colors as far as trying to kind of, piece together what's really going on within each color. The one that stood out to me was the support beatdown style deck, right? You pair this up with red, you pair this up with white, and you can curve out nicely and leverage cards like Saddleback Lagak, of course, being the headliner, but you can play cards like Baloth Pup in the 2-drop slotted uncommon. You get your embodiment of insights, your lead by examples, your Nissa's Judgments if you're lucky, and even in the 5-drop slot, Tajuru Pathwarden has consistently impressed me just as like very much worth the 5 mana. Vines of the Recluse, also a reasonable combat trick in there. And then depending on what color you pair green with in this scenario, you can go for a more support theme, a more kind of combat trick, aggressive theme, if you're, maybe even some landfall if you're going to pair it up with red. And that stuff kind of makes sense to me, right? Like that archetype clicks for me. I know where I want to be with that. But then I was trying to think of, like, there are other cards here that don't go into that deck, and I don't know where they go, and I don't really know what the rest. So what's your take on sort of the second half of green? So
green, I think, goes in 3 different directions. 2.5 different directions. It's kind of funny. So the first one certainly is the all aboard the Lagak train, right? This is, like you said, just you curve out, you play Saddleback, you play Tajuru Pathwarden, profit.
Right.
The other 2 places, one is the colorless theme. This is really leveraging the power of Stalking Drone more than anything else. This is the 2 mana 2/2 that you pay a colorless to get +1/+2. You can only do it once per turn, but it's still just a great card. It's a 2 mana 3/4 in a lot of ways.
Yes.
And that's obviously fantastic. Then you also have like Scion Summoner, and then at the higher end, like Burling Hulk. So, and then uncommon Void Grafter, actually fairly relevant. This is, again, the blue-green deck that I was talking about earlier, where it's a sort of thing that if you start with some blue cards and you see a 5th pick Stalking Drone, you might want to move in, because those cards combine well, and Void Grafter is also good in this deck. It also helps that this deck wants Hedron Crawlers and Cultivator Drones to ramp out your like bigger colorless things. And that is a deck that I've found to be decent. It's not open all the time, just because you would need specific reasons to do it. You just really need Blinding Drones and Stalking Drones are your bread and butter here.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the other things that kind of merges into this deck some of the time is the black-green control deck. This is the Spider deck in a lot of ways. This uses Netcaster Spider, the 3 mana 2/3 that gets +2/+0 when it blocks a flyer because it has reach. And then another very underrated card, Pulse of Marasa.
Mm-hmm.
2 green instant, return a creature or land to target player's hand from their graveyard. That player gains 6 life. It's 2-headed giant, I guess. You can give your teammate those things, but or maybe you gain 6 life.
I think you gain the life, yeah.
Regardless, but you gain the life regardless. That is right. But either way, 2 green to regrowth a creature and gain 6 life turns out is pretty good. This card is a good control card.
Yeah,
I've been impressed with it.
We were both. Remember in the set review and in week 1, we're both like, wow, 6 is a lot. Like this card isn't exciting on the surface, because you're not really gaining a whole lot. You're not getting any card advantage generally. But man, 6 life is a big swing.
Yeah, it definitely is, and this is why during the set review I said this card is fantastic. But
yeah.
Or something like that.
Right along those lines, yeah.
No, Pulse Marasa is a great card for a controlling deck. This is often a black-green deck because I think largely because of Baloth Null Drifter, the 4/5 for 6 that draws 2 creatures from your graveyard. Like, this card is really good and rewards you for being controlling. It also just, like, you have Oblivion Strikes, you have colorless cards. This is the other colorless deck where, you know, the Essence Depleter, Havoc Sower type creatures are pretty good. Scion Summoner, the 2/2 for 3 that summons a 1/1 Scion, also helps kind of enable some of these cards.
Yeah, I like that card quite a bit.
And it also just helps the natural, like, green ramp sort of thing, where you can take advantage of, like, a Lifespring Druid in pack 1, that sort of thing, and cast your good, decent, like, 7-drops.
So that's actually what I was going to ask you about. You mentioned Lifespring Druid coming in that last pack in battle. Are there other cards in there that jump to mind that, you know, go into this sort of more colorless version of the deck? Like, is Eyeless Watcher a card I want? Is Call of the Scions a thing now?
Yeah, these both do kind of what you're looking for, and it's the sort of thing where Birthing Hulk, I think, is the best one. I know you're talking about battle, but I'm saying, like, of the finishers, Birthing Hulk's the best one. But you can pick up Ruin Processors or even Eldrazi Devastator in pack 3 and be happy with those things. I don't actually love Eyeless Watchers or Call the Scions all that much because you're not taking advantage of the fact that you have a lot of devoid creatures, but they do provide you with colorless sources if you need more colorless sources.
Okay.
So overall, green is a kind of interesting color because it's kind of hard to draft, because I think most of the time that you draft green, it's going to be the beatdown version. I think that the support cards are great, and the white-green deck and the red-green deck are both very natural places to end up. Less frequently, but still worth knowing about, worth having in your arsenal, is the ability to go into the colorless and or control theme of green, because that's just a good way to make use of the fact that sometimes you see a 6-pick Stalking Drone or a 6-pick Netcaster Spider. Stalking Drone's a little tricky because that's also good in the beatdown version just because it's a 2-drop, but Netcaster Spider or late Pulse of Marauders, you can frequently get Pulse with 3 or 4 cards left in the pack.
Yeah.
That's just not going to change all that much. I mean, maybe as people start to catch on, it will, but even then, the green-white deck just doesn't want it, so this is exactly what we're talking about. You could be getting passed to by a green drafter and be a green drafter and still be in okay shape. Plus, there's nothing good for you in Battle for Zendikar anyway, so you know, you're not
we tried to find something, but yeah.
and that's what makes green a color that it has more different directions than some of the other colors. Like, you know, if we had to rank the colors on the scale, I think white and red are the 2 colors that are the most flexible just because all their cards can overlap in good ways. Mm-hmm. So if you start with white or red cards, then you have all the paths open to you. If you're taking blue, black, or green cards, you have to know which section of the color you're in, because that really does limit, or at least guide, the way you go from there. Like, black has the Allies theme and the colorless theme. Blue has the colorless theme and a minor surge theme, but mostly colorless. And then green has the support beatdown theme, the colorless theme, and the control theme, even though the colorless and control themes overlap a lot of the time.
You know, that kind of brings, so we've had an interesting chat here, right? And anybody who's into Magic, and especially into Limited, is going to enjoy this type of, like, oh, interesting, like the colors are kind of split in half, and this is a little weird because in a normal set, it's just not the case. Normally the cards within a color tend to work quite well together, and you're more worried about what you're pairing in another color rather than within one color. But there are some strategic implications that I wanted to go over before we sign off, for the day, which is, mainly you have to know which cards go in which groups, right? So some of the colors are more deeply separated than others, and you need to know which cards go in which means that, like if you are drafting that whole, that blinding drone scenario I set up in the intro there, you don't have to panic. You don't have to just go, oh no, I'm in the wrong thing. You need to know that that's the one I want, or that's not the one that's for me, and that's okay. It's not going to be the end of your deck if you have to pass a high quality card that's in your color, as long as it's not one that goes into your strategy. Where normally if you saw a card like that, you might freak out a little bit. You're going to be rewarded for differentiating between the cards during the draft portion, right? You're going to be able to, if you know what your deck's trying to do and which half or chunk of the color that you're drafting you want, you're going to be rewarded for that. And you're not going to get screwed up. Because I've definitely seen people that are a little, maybe not listeners of the show or whatever, that are like still trying to get their grasp on this format, and they get confused because they'll see, like, they'll be drafting blue and then they'll be like, oh, Blinding Drone. Somebody told me that's a good card, I'll take it. And it's like, you could take it, but like that's not really what your deck wants here, right? And there's probably a better pick for you in another color, or even in blue in that pile there. Again, normally when you sit down to draft, your primary concern is kind of getting sorted out what colors you're in, let's say 2 colors, and then you're just taking like the best card out of those 2 colors and kind of moving on with your life as you go through the draft. And maybe near the end of the draft, you start drafting for curve reasons or to fill gaps in strategy stuff or whatever. And that's kind of your standard draft. But here in Oath of the Gatewatch, you actually don't have that luxury. Instead, you really have to understand what your deck's trying to do, and you have to also understand what your deck's not trying to do, and as you navigate through the draft. You also have to know which color combinations want which subgroup. So, if you have a bunch of colorless cards, white doesn't really care about that, for example. So you're probably not going to be blue-white if you have a bunch of blue colorless cards like Luis outlined at the beginning. Because
you're probably just also not going to be white.
Yeah, but I mean, this is why, right? Yeah. Like if white had a lot of colorless stuff, you might actually go into it.
Or if blue had a need for like a curve out support theme or an ally theme.
Or could complement it.
This is exactly why. If you break down what each color is doing and you look at how they match up, you can see why a bunch of different colors match up with other colors. Yeah. Blue and white are the 2 colors that just don't actually have any overlapping sets. And then it's like, oh, that's why blue-white just isn't a deck.
Yeah, which is weird because remember when we first looked at Battle, we were like, well, blue, like this blue-white color pair doesn't have any synergies with the sort of set level synergies that we see in Battle for Zendikar. And it turns out, well, the cards just really went well together. That isn't the case here. So we need to find some reason to put these 2 colors together that complement each other, and they don't exist. So the colors just don't go that well together. It's interesting. Definitely. I kind of like the curveball that they've thrown us here.
Yeah, I like that things are shaken up, like how blue-white was one of the best color combinations, and now it's, I think, the worst. And, the green decks were not very draftable. Now there's actually a variety of different good draftable green decks.
I like that too. Yeah, Oath of the Gatewatch has been interesting. I think we'll look back on it. I don't think I'm going to look back and be like, oh, that's an all-timer. I can't wait to draft Oath again. But at the same time, I'm going to be like, that made us think. Like that set was not easy to get a grasp on, and I like that challenge. All right, well, let's wrap it up here, Luis. We went through all the colors, and I think that this is a good stopping point for the show. I want to remind you that Limited Resources is brought to you by channelfireball.com. Make sure you're checking them out for awesome free content, a full selection of singles, as well as sealed product. And also gphouston.com if you're planning on coming out. And if you do, come say hi. Luis and I will both be there. And we're going to be doing coverage for Wizards, but that doesn't mean you can't come up and say hi if you're there, and we'd love to chat whenever we're not on the air. If you want to find us on social media, if you're not going to GP Houston and you still want to say hi, Twitter is a good place to do it. I'm Marshall_LR and Luis is LSV. You can find everything related to the show, including links to, the subreddit and stuff that I talked about earlier on lrcast.com. That will do it for this week. And we just want to thank you for taking the time out of your week to hang out with us. We do appreciate you doing that, and we'll talk to you next week. All right, we're doing a little something different this week. Instead of the normal sign-off from Luis, I went ahead and gathered a bunch of kind of stories, Magic Bad Beat stories, that kind of thing from people out at the Pro Tour. So let's listen to what they had to say. This first one comes from the big rig himself, Neil Rigby.
I'm playing in a PTQ final, and this is years ago. It was extended was the format, that's how long ago it was. And it's game 3, and I've totally outplayed my opponent to the point where I've got a Masticore and 8 mana, and he's got a Masticore and 5 mana. So he goes, I'll attack, and I'm like, pay 8, shoot your Masticore 4 times. He's like, regenerate it. I'm like, okay. Untap, discard, draw, attack you for 4. He's like, yep. I've got 4 cards in hand, he's got 1 card in hand, so he's like, discard my 1 card. Attack, I'm like, shoot it 4 times. He's like, regenerate. I'm like, alright then, attack you for 4. And then he's on 4 life, and I go, shoot your guy 4 times. He's like, regenerate it. I'm like, my turn, untap, upkeep, draw. And I'm like, oh, I didn't discard. My Masticore goes away, and then his Masticore then hits me 5 times and I can't kill it. And I'm just like, oh. And his awful play of keeping his Masticore around that's just making him discard a card and tap some land ends up winning him the game because I just forget to pay my upkeep on the last turn.
My name's Maria Bartholdi, and my Bad Beat story happened on Magic Online. I was playing an Oath of the Gatewatch draft, and I drafted a super sweet green-white support deck. I mean, I had 2 Saddleback Legacs, I had a Relief Captain, I had a Gideon, okay? So this deck was amazing. I think I had 3 Isolation Zones. Anyway, my opponent in round 2 comes out with the dumbest deck known to man. It's playing Lava Step Raider, it's playing Stoneforge Acolyte, like the Equipment Matters dudes from Oath. And I'm like, no problem. I'll beat this person with my hands tied behind my back. They play 2 Bone Saws, a Chitinous Cloak, several other equipments like Hedron Blade, and they've got a Stoneforge Summoner to make their 3/1 whenever they have a land drop. And all they do is keep equipping every single piece of equipment onto that stupid 3/1 and beating me in the face with it. And the first couple times I'm like, well, I take it because who cares, it's getting exiled. Well, as the game goes on and I draw nothing but lands, I'm just like, oh god. I've got to start doing something. This is getting out of control. I've never seen one creature wearing 5 pieces of equipment that was so dumb that it exiled itself at the end of the turn. So anyway, that deck beat me and I was really mad.